Hello, my name is Benson and I'll be guiding you through a very sensitive and unfortunate topic, that is elder abuse and neglect. So just before we get into some details about abuse and neglect, it is important for us to understand the size of the population we are talking about. This will give us a perspective of just how many people are being affected by this every single day. Currently, seniors make up the fastest growing age group, and this trend is expected to continue for the next several decades due mainly to a below replacement fertility rate, an increase in life expectancy, and the aging of the baby boom generation. In 2011, an estimated 5 million Canadians were 65 years of age or older, a number that is expected to double within the next 25 years to reach 10.3 million seniors by 2036. By 2051, about 1 in 4 Canadians is expected to be 65 or over. So below we have a visual representation of Canada's aging population. As you can see, in 1900s, only 5% were aged 65 plus. By 2030, we could expect this to reach 20%. And this does make sense because the baby boomer generation, like my parents, are now aging, and they do make up a large proportion of Canada's total population. Currently, 1 in 5 Canadians believes they know a senior who might be experiencing some form of abuse. Abuse and neglect in any form is wrong, and unfortunately for seniors, they are a population that is one of the most susceptible to this form of violence that is happening in our communities. Elder abuse includes actions that cause physical, mental, financial, psychological, or sexual harm to an older adult. Neglect includes situations where a person or organization fails to provide services or necessary care. This can be refusal or failure by those responsible to provide food, shelter, healthcare, or protection for a vulnerable elder. Elder abuse frequently occurs because of the abuser's power and control over an older person, and as disheartening as it might sound, the affected person usually knows the person mistreating them. Most commonly, this is caused by a family member, a friend, someone who provides assistance, or healthcare providers. So some of you might be thinking why this type of violence happens, and this is because the abuser is probably dependent on the older adult for money, food, or shelter. Another reason maybe is that the person might not be mentally stable or have addiction issues with drugs, alcohol, or gambling. In some scenarios, however, this might not even be the case. In one study, they found that lifelong patterns of domestic violence are often reversed when the parent or the formerly dominating spouse becomes less powerful and is now the victim instead of the abuser. So just to provide some statistics before we get into some recent evidence, here in Ontario we do have a lower percentage of violence coming from family members, that is 50 per 100,000 in relations to other areas in Canada. However, there is still 2 to 10% of seniors that will experience abuse in their lifetime. Studies found that most complaints were most often family members, followed by healthcare professionals and then social service agency staff. So here we have a pie chart that was constructed using NORS data presented in 2010. We can see that physical abuse does make up the largest proportion of the pie chart. However, I did find that this study was contradicting with other studies when I was doing research, but I'd like to emphasize the word report since a lot of abuse does go silent. So I want to give an example of sexual abuse. Many people who are sexually abused or assaulted, they have difficulty speaking about and or reporting the issue due to embarrassment or fear, which might fluctuate with the data. I'd like to point out that this data was taken from nursing homes in the US and does not really reflect Canadian nursing homes because I do believe that it's really dependent on the elders' environments and surroundings and the people that work there. But this does give us a good idea of the different types of elder abuse that is going around in our communities. Something that stood out to me in the study and why I chose to show this is because a large percentage of this pie graph was resident to resident abuse, which many studies fail to touch upon. And we can see that elder abuse can happen among each other and does not strictly cohere to people in younger generations. So which older people are most at risk and who is the most susceptible to abuse? The NCAA study found that victims in sustained reports of elder abuse were predominantly women. In addition, more than half of the victims were reported Caucasian and half were aged 80 plus. In contrast, perpetrators were most typically male between the ages of 36 and 50. From this, 62% were family members. So now we're going to cover some of our research findings from various scholarly papers and peer-reviewed articles. We wanted to include impact of elder abuse since our findings showed that long-term abuse does come with some serious side effects. Research from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police state that stress associated with abuse and neglect can lead to long-term physical and psychological problems, including heart attack, stroke, anxiety, angina, depression, high blood pressure, panic attacks, poverty, isolation, over and under medicating, and in some cases, death. Our first peer-reviewed article presented focuses on the qualitative study of older people's conceptualization of elder abuse undertaken in Ireland. The purpose of this report was to produce an older person's understanding of elder abuse and their perspectives on accessing help. The study utilizes qualitative data with elements of a grounded theory approach. The study notes that the sensitivity of the topics of elder abuse and the lack of disclosure in everyday conversation were important for the choice of methods, since those who could not fully reveal experiences were provided an inaccurate representation. Focus groups were selected to assist participants to reveal experiences and perspectives that may be more accessible with a realistic group interaction rather than the formality of interviews. Data was collected from 8 focus groups across Ireland, 4 in the north of Ireland and 4 in the Republic of Ireland. To keep consistency, 4 older people were recruited as peer researchers to assist in leading the focus groups because of the greater similarity of their life experiences to those respondents. Those that participated in the study were living in the community and were at least 65 years of age or older. Questions focused on participants' understanding of the abuse of older people, the forms of abuse, reasons why people may experience abuse, ways to prevent abuse, and support for those who have experienced abuse. In total, 58 people took part in 8 focus groups, each comprising of 4 to 12 people. Respondents recognized the categories of abuse used in documents by professionals in terms of physical, financial, verbal, psychological abuse, and neglect. In no focus groups was sexual abuse mentioned until raised by the researcher. Findings has shown main themes emerging. Societal abuse was a fundamental category to emerge from the data, where elders felt that there was a diminishment of older people's personhood. Participants felt that they were being treated differently because they were too old. One quotes, "I am not treated as a normal person who still thinks, still learns, and still works just as much as you can." Participants also believe that once a person appears old, that they are perceived as stupid and incompetent by some family member or wider society. The experience of loss of respect in society extended from public transport to experiences in healthcare facilities. Diminishing or weakening the personhood of older people in society has brought older individuals to have showed to decrease confidence, self-esteem, and fear for the future. Another emerging topic was abuse in family relationships. Most of abuse coming from family members was reported as financial abuse. The issue of trust and duty in financial transactions within families occurred in all of the groups. An example that was given was grandchildren doing the shopping and taking the money for themselves for the grandparents' purse. Financial issues seem to highlight aspects of family relationships such as duties, rights, and trust. The third theme mentioned was vulnerability. Those that were particularly vulnerable were older people with physical or cognitive impairment who have to depend on others for care. Their dependency gives their career to a certain degree of power, and participants believe that this power can be used by carers whose nature is to control. This was perceived as the biggest threat to their overall well-being in terms of deterioration in their health, either physical or mental. One participant quotes in the study that being dependent on others for care creates opportunity for older people to be mistreated. Emotional underpinning of abuse was also a theme that emerged in the study. This abuse impacted on older persons' emotional well-being and was deemed the most damaging. Participants described this as quote-unquote the worst. The concept of abuse represented an insidious process rather than something that suddenly happened, like being robbed. Those that participated mentioned that this type of abuse meant living with something in your mentality, as one quotes. Hence, each form of abuse was usually associated with an element of psychological pressure, referred to as mental torture by some participants. This psychological pressure was exerted through many different elements, where most of them felt their inability to say no without fear of repercussions for their safety or daily well-being. Some examples mentioned was giving their relatives their pension, keeping quiet, or pressure into moving into a nursing home. The last thing mentioned was intent. The central feature in conceptualizing abuse seemed to be the emotional impact, particularly the betrayal of the expected caring relationship and the loss of respect, emphasizing the trust aspect. The perceived intent of the perpetrator of the action was key to the perception as to whether this was abusive. At the same time, there was recognition that some older people were more vulnerable than others, such as those who were ill and those dependent on others for care. Moving on to the discussion, there were a number of limitations and innovations noticed in the study. Firstly, participants that were involved in their communities as members of social clubs or groups and may not be representative of older people in general in Ireland. There could also be a limitation on how accurate information might be, since some of those experiences of older people could be marginalized. For example, someone who is cognitively impaired or unwell. The study was also limited to elder abuse and did not mention much of the neglect aspect of abuse, which requires more research. We also noticed that the study was not geographically located in Canada, which lacks data relevant to communities here in Ontario. The study, however, stood out since it was innovative in the involvement of peer researchers. The study notes that their contribution was valuable in facilitating a more open discussion on a sensitive topic in the focus group. However, a con to this was that there was a risk of bias. An example of this was if they were regarded as opinionated and were seen as expressing their own views rather than facilitating or sharing of views of group members. In conclusion, there were three main points to take from the study. Firstly was a loss of respect in society and relationships. Also mentioned was the emotional abuse. It is important to understand that this aspect was seen as the most debilitating compared to all other forms of abuse. The last point to take was a breach of trust. Intentionally, the perpetrator was seen as important or was not perceived as abusive in the respondents' views. So we have another study that we want to cover real quick, and this kind of works in contrast to the first study. What we took from the first study was an older person's perspective to abuse and neglect. In this study, we are looking at it from a medical and laboratory standpoint that will help others identify those that are being abused and neglected. We chose this study since elder abuse and neglect are highly prevalent but unfortunately go underdetected and underreported. Medical and laboratory data can be beneficial in identifying abuse, since most of the time abuse will carry on for years before it is discovered. So we thought it would be interesting to include a study that will be helpful in the successful determination of abuse and neglect. Studies suggest that as few as 1 in 14 cases of elder abuse is reported to authorities, and much of the associated morbidity and mortality is likely due to the delay in identification and intervention. Victims may be unable to report abuse because of isolation, severe illness, or dementia, or may be reluctant to report because of fear of the abuser. Therefore, recognition and reporting by others is critical for identifying victims and providing justice. This study uses a qualitative and quantitative meta-analysis approach in order to identify clinical and laboratory findings commonly found in these cases, with the primary focus on determining if medical and laboratory data can be helpful in the successful determination of abuse and neglect. Results have shown that there are clinical and medical clues of abuse such as malnutrition, dehydration, alterations in status of chronic illness, hypothermia and hypothermia, rhamdoliolysis, toxicological findings, and post-mortem biochemical values. So we don't want to go through each medical condition since it would take too much time. However, it is relatively interesting since they can trace each medical condition with a cause. For example, if we take a look at the first one, dehydration was linked to caregivers refusing fluid intake to older people to decrease bedwetting. Feel free to pause the video in order to give yourself a brief overview of the results presented in this lab. In many cases, these markers may be the only clue that abuse and neglect has even occurred. Limitations to the study is that laboratory values can be seen in other disease states and are not specifically pathognomonic to elder abuse. The study concludes that elder abuse and neglect are highly prevalent but often go undetected. More research is required to better characterize findings that, when identified, can contribute to the certainty in cases of suspected abuse. However, the medical and laboratory data can be helpful in the successful determination of abuse and neglect. So now we're going to cover material that is going to help stop elder abuse and neglect from occurring. It is noteworthy that Canada's Association for the 50 Plus suggests that elder abuse and neglect should be seen as an abuse of one's human rights. The province of Ontario was the first to implement policies to improve elder abuse and neglect in Canada. Ontario highlights 3 strategies to help elder abuse and neglect. Firstly is a coordination of community services. This is ensuring that the elderly have a place to turn to when they need assistance. Training for frontline staff. Training opportunities for sectors serving older adults to increase their ability and to identify and to respond to the signs of elder abuse. Lastly is public education to raise awareness. This entails educating and re-educating seniors on financial elder abuse, telemarketing fraud, and identity theft. The Ontario Senior Secretariat is the leading implementation of Ontario's strategy to combat elder abuse in partnership with Elder Abuse Ontario. Elder Abuse Ontario is a non-profit charitable organization dedicated to the prevention of elder abuse and neglect. Elder abuse regional consultants located across the province help promote and support efforts to address and prevent elder abuse. The consultants act as a key resource for justice and community service providers and local elder abuse networks responding to elder abuse throughout Ontario. A Canadian example of this was the Prevention and Awareness Training Kit to educate the Alberta, Canada community along with others on elder abuse. There are several laws and legislations that have already criminalized any action of elder abuse and neglect. Firstly is the Retirement Home Act. And this act states that there is mandatory reporting required for people to report elder abuse to the Register of Retirement Homes Regulatory Authority if they suspect any harm to a retirement home residents under Section 7.5. A person who has reasonable grounds to suspect that any of the following points listed has occurred or may occur shall immediately report suspicion and information upon which it is based to the register. This includes improper or incompetent treatment or care of a resident that resulted in harm or risk of harm to the resident, abuse of a resident by anyone or neglect of a resident by the licensee or the staff of the retirement home of the resident if it results in harm or risk of harm to the resident, unlawful conduct that resulted in harm or risk of harm to the resident, and misuse or misappropriation of a resident's money. The Long-Term Care Act states that there are provisions in the Act to protect residents from elder abuse, promoting zero tolerance in Section 19. This is a resident-centered care, and there is mutual respect between resident, staff, family, and friends. This provides high-quality services to all residences, provides clear and consistent standards, provides compliance, inspection, and the enforcement system, and there are consequences for the breach of the standards. So there are ways you can prevent elder abuse, and one way is listening to seniors and their caregivers, that is, being sensitive to the needs of seniors, intervening and speaking up when elder abuse and neglect is suspected, and finally, educating others on how to recognize and report elder abuse. In addition, doctors should continue to screen seniors during regular visits, the training of law enforcement and other agencies to deliver workshops targeting this issue, and the promotion of elder abuse and prevention by increasing awareness to faith-based leaders. So as mentioned, there are ways to protect elders from abuse and neglect. In 2009, the Government of Canada released a public commercial to raise awareness of elder abuse and neglect that is happening around us.
Many Canadians are in the dark about elder abuse, but turning a blind eye will only make the problem worse. Financial, physical, emotional, neglect. It's time to face the reality of elder abuse. Learn more at seniors.gc.ca or call for a brochure. A message from the Government of Canada.
So as you guys can see from the video, there were multiple ways where elders were abused. Some of those have been mentioned in the PowerPoint were shown in this video, like physical abuse, financial abuse, and verbal abuse. I personally do think that this is an accurate depiction of what elder abuse can look like. However, it just skims the surface of the different types of abuse going on. Since this is a commercial to the public, I feel that this was pretty censored in terms of showing what could actually happen to some seniors. When looking at it from an ageism perspective, I do feel that there is a slight prejudice and discrimination since they are perceived as vulnerable and none of the elders shown in the video seem to defend themselves, which might not be the case for all elders. However, as we mentioned, elders in reality are more susceptible to abuse and neglect due to their tendency to be dependent on others. And I think that the whole point of this commercial was to raise awareness of elder abuse happening around us and to speak up if you're seeing it happen. In conclusion, we need to understand that our elderly population is going to make up almost 20% of our population in 2030, which is actually a very high number compared to the 1990s. So it is important to be aware about the abuse and neglect since about 2 to 10% of elders are abused in a lifetime. Studies have shown us that there has been a loss of respect within society and relationships. Some of those relationships consisted of someone that the elder originally trusted, but ended up being the perpetrator. This adds on to the emotional abuse, which elders stated to be the most traumatizing. In addition to this, we have also found in cases where abuse is going unseen that there are toxicological and medical indicators that will help in the successful determination of elder abuse and neglect. Canada also already has multiple legislations and laws that criminalizes any actions that may cause abuse and neglect towards an elder. However, there are still ways we can help, such as educating others, speaking up, and listening to the seniors around us. So that is it for our slides. I'd like to thank you guys for sitting here and listening to my presentation. I really hope you guys have learned something from this. I know I sure have, because, you know, if it was my grandparents, I would really want to protect them and make sure they're safe. And I'm sure you guys would want to do the same. Thank you.